today about justice. People are demanding justice for the things that have happened to them many times for good reason. But when you think about that word justice, the concept of justice, from a biblical perspective, what does that really mean? When God calls us to do justice, what does He expect of us as disciples of Jesus Christ? That's what I want to talk to you about today on The Well.
Today on The Well,
Dr. Swanson explains justice in a fresh new way.
and in our Living Water segment, William Andrews shares what he learned when he was at his very lowest point in life. And now, with a fresh drink from The Well, Dr. David Swanson.
If you have ever been to New York City, I would imagine that you've ridden the subway train a few times. It's not exactly the most pristine environment in the world, but it does a pretty good job for moving hundreds of thousands of people around the city. I remember being on a train on my way out to Yankee Stadium, and I'm not sure whether I had more fun on the train or at the game just because of the camaraderie that we had on the train, all being baseball fans. It was just a great slice of life being on that train with all those people. So I was a little surprised when I read in the New York Times about a 13-year-old runaway named Francisco Hernandez Jr., who quietly slipped into the subway system and disappeared for 11 days. He had $10, a Metro card, and a backpack, and managed to ride through the boroughs of New York undetected for those 11 days, just sitting there as the ebb and flow of hundreds of thousands of people took place on that train every single day. Now, it started when he had gotten in some trouble at his school in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. It's a school for developmentally disabled children. See, Francisco has a form of autism, and it makes it very difficult for him to interact with other human beings. He just doesn't do very well socially, and he'd gotten in trouble a couple of times, and then he got in trouble again at school, and he really didn't want to go home. He was afraid his parents were going to yell at him, so he said to one of his friends, "I just don't want anyone to scream at me." So he took his cell phone, took the SIM card out and the battery, threw them away because he knew his parents would try to find him, and he slipped onto the train. And for 11 days, he wasn't noticed in spite of the fact that his panicked parents were leading an all-out search. The New York City Police Department was involved. The Mexican consulate was involved. They plastered flyers with his picture on it all over the New York subway system. The subway system has surveillance cameras everywhere. And yet for 11 days, nobody could find a 13-year-old boy riding the trains by himself until finally a police officer spotted him at a train station on Coney Island trying to buy some food. And he was returned to his parents. Now, you can imagine there was quite a lengthy investigation after he was found to try to understand, how do you lose a 13-year-old kid on a subway train? In a subway system. How did that possibly happen? The Mexican consulate was involved. New York police involved again. Parents. And his mother said this: "I don't think people really knew how to approach him. He doesn't deal with people very well, doesn't speak much English, so I doubt anyone paid him much attention." Can you imagine this student sitting there in a red hoodie, backpack in his lap, hundreds of thousands of people going by, and his mom says, "I'm not sure anyone paid him any attention." You know, I'm not sure that's true. I bet people noticed. I mean, my assumption is that there were at least a few people who looked at him and thought, "Gosh, I wonder what that kid's doing." I know if it had been me, if I'd been on the train, I would have been going about my business, and I would probably looked at him and I would have thought, "You know, that's odd that kid's sitting there by himself." And then I, no doubt, would have gotten off the train and gone on about my day. I wouldn't have done anything. I just would have thought, that's kind of unusual. Now, I said last week that some of you are a little bit more emotionally sensitive than I am, and I would imagine there were some people on that train who looked at that boy and they thought, "Gosh, that's really sad. I wonder what's going on with him. I wonder why he's there by himself." I bet you had feelings. They would have had feelings of mercy towards this child, maybe would have been motivated in some way to try to reach out. And yet, in spite of all those feelings and empathy and compassion and mercy, nobody actually took action. No one actually did anything. Even in the middle of the night, when it would have been highly unusual for a 13-year-old boy to be alone on a train, nobody actually stepped in and said, "Where are your parents? And can I help you?" And it just seems to me to be a sad commentary on where we've gotten as a culture. Because I think there was a time when we had a sense of connection one to another, when we felt like we were a part of a common family that tried to look after each other and care for each other and protect each other. But that's kind of disintegrated now into a culture that's really based around the individual. We're individual, separate units that are pursuing individual goals and individual needs. And I'm reminded, I love what John said about Mother Teresa. We've kind of forgotten that we belong one to another. Instead, we've kind of actually developed a fear of strangers. We don't know what someone else might do to us. We're afraid of the evil that exists in the world. And so we step back, and you know what? Justifiably so. We read about it in the paper. We read about what can happen when we encounter people who look seemingly harmless and bad things happen. So we find ourselves insulating ourselves, moving back. And it's part of just our sinful, fallen human nature. You do it, I do it, we all do it. We might see something, we might feel empathy, but it's not going to supersede the agenda that we have for our given day. As I said last week, when it comes to matters of self, we'll always choose self over the needs of others, at least until such time as when God breaks in and transforms our lives and shows us there's a better way, there's a higher way, that God wants us to be engaged in building the kingdom. And that's what Micah started to address for us last week. He says there are three things that I require of you. God says, I want you to act in these three ways. And for those of you who might not have been here last week, Mike is in a court of law. He's acting as the prosecuting attorney before God the judge. Israel is the defendant, and he's trying to show why Israel is guilty of disobedience and rebellion against God. And one of the things that he says is there's a reason why you're guilty and why you're really even more guilty, because you knew better. He says, God's shown you what you're supposed to do. In other words, Israel, you knew this. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to act justly, and you love mercy, and you're supposed to walk humbly with God. That's what you're called to do, and yet you're not doing that. These are not the things that we see in you. And so as Micah begins to break that open, what we discover is there's this indelible link between mercy and justice. Now, I started last week with mercy, and I did that on purpose because I'm not sure that you and I are ever going to do justice. I'm not sure we're ever going to enact changes in structures and systems until we really begin to feel the pain of others. We have to really engage and understand their suffering before we're ever going to take action. But it doesn't mean that we just get to do mercy alone. He says there are three things. We're going to talk about humility next week. But he says, I want you to love mercy, but there's also this connection between mercy and justice. Probably one of the best books I've read in the last 6 months. It's called Toxic Charity. It's by a guy named Robert Lupton, and he says this. It's kind of long, and I'm going to stop in the middle of it a couple of times, so bear with me. But here's the relationship between mercy and justice. He says, twin together, these commands lead us to holistic involvement. Divorced, here's the important thing, they're deformed. So one without the other is deformed. Mercy without justice degenerates into dependency and entitlement, preserving the power of the giver over the recipient. All right, understand this. If all I ever do is show mercy, if all I ever do is try to help you feel less pain, then I'm always in power over you. You're always dependent on me for what I have, but I never actually solve your situation. I never actually help do something to systemically cure the pain. You always are going to need me, and that's not just, that's deformed. But then the flip side is also true. Justice without mercy is cold and impersonal, more concerned about rights than relationships. So if all I do is try to do justice in your life, I try to change systems, but I never actually get to know you. I never know you as a human being. I never communicate the love of Christ to you. Then you never really come to taste the love and the affection that God has for you. So justice without mercy is also deformed. He goes on. The addict needs both food and treatment. The young woman needs both a safe place to sleep and a way out of her entrapping lifestyle. Street kids need both friendship and jobs. Mercy combined with justice creates. All right, do you hear that? Mercy with justice creates. Yes, being a friend to someone is merciful. Giving them a bed is merciful. Helping them overcome some element of their pain, that's mercy.
Coming up on our Living Water segment, William Andrews tells what happened when God stepped in.
I was involved in politics up in Springfield, Massachusetts. I could pick up the phone and call the lieutenant governor, the mayor's office, city councilman, and wouldn't be put on hold. I mean, I had everything. And in the process, started doing recreational drugs, and then people, I guess, thought that, I must have had some type of connection, and wanted me to get drugs for them, and I started doing that, and so it became a business, but the problem was I became my best customer.
Today, in our Living Water segment, I want you to meet a man named William Andrews, a local pastor here in the Orlando area. If doing justice biblically means we're going to restore the right order of things according to God's original plan, then William experienced that firsthand through some very difficult, trying, and dark days.
Because of my drug addiction, I was being run out of town. I had a contract, people wanted to kill me, and I come all the way down to Florida. And now I'm working labor pools. I went from a 6-figure salary to making $48 a day. It's the downfall of sin. Typical day was being at the labor pool office at 5 o'clock in the morning to be the first one to try to get out on a ticket. At 3:30, most of the guys would start breaking down, and you get back to the labor pool by 4:30. As soon as you get your check and walk out the door, there all the drug dealers would be. You would buy your dope, and most of the guys by 5:30, 6 o'clock would be dead broke because they done smoked up all their money. Then you would start all over again. It's such a terrible lifestyle that, it's when you're constantly trying to survive. You're really on the edge of insanity. I remember getting high in the bathroom of a bar, and the floor was filthy. There would be broken bottles, there would be spilled beer, there would be cigarette butts, defecation. I remember being in one time with my back against the wall, smoking, trying to light my dope, and the dope fell off on the floor. And I remember I was on the floor on my knees, trying to find my dope and rubbing my hand across that floor. And I was just on my knees crying, asking God to help me, and looked down, and there was my dope on a pile of dry vomit. And I picked it up and I smoked it. That tore me up. The next day I'm sitting behind the Salvation Army, and I asked God to kill me. And I'm sitting there and I'm weeping and crying. I want to stop, but at the same time I want to hit. And I'm asking God to take my life. And I remember it's a voice I heard inside, but it was outside. I don't know how to describe it, but I remember hearing, how can I take something from you that you won't give me? That Sunday I went to the feeding program, and that's where God stepped in. Central Church of the Nazarene, that was right across the street. I had been on a 2-week run, a binge, smoking dope. I could literally smell my feet through my shoes. And I walked in there, and Bill Austin was coming out of the sanctuary. He walked towards me with his hand out, and I walked towards him, and he walked right by my hand and hugged me. I just melted, started crying and weeping, and went into the prayer room, and 3 men prayed over me. And I remember being there just telling God how sorry I was. It was an admittance that was coming from my heart to God that not only am I wrong, this is the reason why I'm wrong. And I want you to know that I'm not going to do it no more, because you mean more to me in my life than being high and feeling good and satisfying myself. That moment of confession, I think for the first time was done out of the sincerity of my heart, and that's what God saw. I remember hearing the voice of God telling me that I would never use drugs again, and that I was going to be his servant. My life was transformed. Today, I'm a senior pastor here at the Heart of Mercy Community Church. I found myself start wanting to minister to those who were left out in the streets and those that were on drugs. You have to be the pastor, the minister, but you have to be one of them. They want the pastor to jump down in the hole. And when you jump down in the hole, you show them, yeah, I've been here before. I know what this hole is all about. Come on, let me show you how I did it. Let me show you what God did for me. God is looking for a sincere heart. That's the key ingredient. You know, we do a lot of confession. We're always sorry about something, you know, but does it really change our action? Does it really change us? Are we really sorry enough to turn away from it and to leave it alone? For me, that was the beginning of the healing process. That was when I started to feel the relief and the freedom from sin.
What a tremendous story to see a man who was so down, so low in life and not knowing where he was going to find help. But because people believed in doing justice, trying to help William restore the right order of things in his life and giving him access to the things that could create change, William rediscovered his faith in Jesus and came to a place where he's no longer homeless, but now serving as a pastor. Just further testimony to God's work if we'll seek to do justice together in the kingdom of God.
Over the course of human history, what we constantly depicted was that we were willing to separate ourselves if it were to our own benefit, even if it exploited other people. If we could do something that would push us up, even if it meant pushing others down, then we were okay with that. So you trace the sinful arc of human history over hundreds of thousands of years, and what you find is that we create governmental systems and socioeconomic systems and gender systems and class systems and so many other systems that push some up and others down. And the ones going up are the ones with power and wealth, and the ones who are going down are the ones who lack those very things. And it's just part of our sinful human nature. When we're left to our own devices, we're always going to choose what benefits us, even at the neglect of our brothers. And God says that's not just. In fact, he says again in verse 6, I want you to loose the chains of injustice. So when you read that in Scripture, and God calls us to loose the chains of injustice, what does that mean? It means that you and I are engaged in restoring the right order of things, restoring things to the way that God originally intended, when all people would be equally valued because we're made in the image of God, worthy of dignity and respect and love. That's what it means to do justice. It's the restoration of the right order of things. But see, that's not how we tend to think about justice, is it? I mean, you come in here today and you hear a sermon on justice, and what we tend to think about when we hear the word justice is retribution, right? Justice is when someone has wronged me and I want them to pay, or something happened to me that was wrong and I want it to be made right. So justice is something we get. I went to Dallas to go to Lee's reunion with her. I find a parking place outside the hotel where the party's going to happen. It's a wide open parking place. There's nothing unusual about it. I pull in. 4 hours later, I come back. There's a green ticket on my car for $115 because I was parked too close to a fire hydrant. The curb was not painted a different color. The fire hydrant was buried